Welcome everyone to today's presentation. My name is Dr. Silkman, and today's presentation is entitled Making a Magician. Show me the swabs. And what I'd like to cover today is the following topics. I'd like to examine a Toyota RAV4 blood planting scenario in order to frame Stephen Avery. I like to have a look at where did all the Stephen Avery blood swabs actually come from, and how plausible was a blood planting scenario. Was it something that was difficult to do? Was it something that was relatively straightforward? Now, I also like to ask a controversial question. Would anyone from the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory engage in any nefarious activity? And finally, I like to ask some questions about the Steve Avery case. Okay, well, it's important that we establish a few basics in the case, and that is that Sherry Culhane did all the forensic DNA analysis in the Steve Avery case that commenced in 2007. And I quote Ken Kratz from the Stephen Avery trial. Well, that same woman, Sherry Culhane, processes this vehicle because she's the unit head. Because this is such an important case, she does the work herself. She does all of the analysis of all of the blood that's found in these cases. And so we need to ask the following question. When were the vehicles entered into evidence? Now, we know that the Toyota RAV4 was found at the Avery salvage yard on the 5th of November 2005. And if you note, it was entered into evidence on the 7th of November at 10:45 a.m. If we have a look at Stephen Avery's Pontiac Grand Am, this vehicle was seized at Crivets on the 6th of November 2005, and it was entered into evidence on the 8th of November at 1:48 p.m. So let us go through a speculative scenario. And here we're looking at a possible Stephen Avery blood planting scenario. Now remember, this is what the defense brought forward in the case, the blood planting scenario. So how would you do it? Here is a possibility. I would start with Stephen Avery's 1996 blood vial. As we know, it contains EDTA, the anticoagulant EDTA. This blood vial was stored at the Manitowoc County Clerk of Court's office. Now, why would you want to start off with this particular blood vial? For a start, you know absolutely it belongs to Stephen Avery. In addition, you have access to this particular blood vial. We know that the cap has been opened or disturbed. Air has entered into the vial, and this was something that was also noted by the FBI Dr. Mark LeBeau, and you can see that there's blood around the rim of the cap. Clearly this tube has been opened. Now all one requires is a very small volume of blood, around about 300 to 600 microliters, and I did a video on this prior if you wish to have a look at that one. You then take that blood and you essentially set up the Toyota RAV4 after it has left the Avery salvage yard, and all one required was 6 drops of blood. Now all you need is a dropper to place the blood within the RAV4, something that is very easy to do. Now we also know that the driver's side door was found unlocked by Mr. Groffey when he was at the Madison Crime Laboratory. We also know from witnesses that all the doors were locked at the Avery salvage yard. Witnesses have stated, and we'll examine this, that no blood was noted inside the Toyota RAV4 at the Avery salvage yard when it was found on November the 5th. Now, all one has to do is take a swab of the blood. You do a presumptive test and it's positive for blood, and this was done by Culhane. Once the swab is positive for blood, you take another swab, and from here you can obtain a genomic DNA or genomic DNA STR profile by PCR analysis, and again this was done by Culhane. The DNA sample gave a full genomic DNA STR profile of Stephen Avery. That meant that Stephen Avery was effectively framed. Now, the important thing to realize with this scenario is that all of the recovered Toyota RAV4 blood swabs should contain EDTA. Okay, so how is it possible to actually fool the FBI's EDTA testing of the blood swabs? Now, we just showed in the subsequent slide how easy it actually was to plant the blood in the Toyota RAV4 in order to frame Steve Avery. But the state had requested the FBI to test the Toyota RAV4 swabs for the presence of EDTA. So how would you do this? Well, we know that Stephen Avery's trailer and his garage had droplets of blood. Now remember, this is fresh blood. The blood is EDTA free. We also know that in Stephen Avery's Pontiac Grand Am, there were droplets of blood in there too, and the blood also is EDTA free. We know that swabs were taken of the blood samples that were found. Then a presumptive test was done and they came up as being positive for blood. Another swab was taken of the blood samples and a genomic STR profile was done by PCR analysis. Again, these were all done by Culhane, and as you can see here, each one of these samples contained the full genomic DNA STR profile belonging to Stephen Avery. Now, how do you fool the FBI? Well, all one has to do is provide the FBI with 3 relabeled swabs that don't have EDTA on them. So if the FBI tests these swabs, what results would they get? Let's ask Dr. LeBeau. Question: what is that opinion? Answer: my opinion is that the bloodstains did not come from that tube of blood. And we're talking about this particular blood vial. Now, this scenario means that you can use the original blood vial to place Stephen Avery's blood in the RAV4 in order to frame him. You then provide the FBI with substituted blood swabs, and when they test it for EDTA, they don't find any. And remember, the FBI did not re-swab the Toyota RAV4. They tested the swabs that were provided to them. Alright, now as we can see here, the Toyota RAV4 was swabbed by Cherie Culhane. The Pontiac Grand Am was also swabbed by Cherie Culhane, and there was another item, a very important item, and that was the key that was found in Stephen Avery's bedroom. Now note, no blood was noted on this key. Okay, so this is how it worked. Various items from the Toyota RAV4, the Pontiac Grand Am, and the RAV4 spare key, remember that didn't have blood, Cherie Culhane extracted DNA from all of those samples. And lo and behold, on November the 10th, and remember that date, it's important, she ran the STR profile through the Wisconsin DNA database. Lo and behold, who gets a hit? Stephen Allen Avery. And Cherie Culhane even states in her report, and I quote, "A biological standard from Stephen Allen Avery must be submitted to this laboratory for confirmation of the match to the STR DNA profile obtained from item A6. So this is very interesting, and I'll tell you why. Because on November the 10th, or by November the 10th, just 5 days after discovery of the Toyota RAV4, the investigators and Kratz knew that Stephen Avery's DNA was inside the vehicle and was on the RAV4 spare key that was found in his trailer. That's 5 days after it was found. Alright, now further swabs were taken from Stephen Avery's garage, and additional swabs were taken from Stephen Avery's trailer. So now we can actually summarize all of the blood swabs that contained Stephen Avery's full genomic DNA STR profile. Now we know that 6 blood swabs were taken by Culhane from the Toyota RAV4, and you can see the various items. 5 blood swabs were taken by Culhane from Stephen Avery's Pontiac Grand Am. 6 blood swabs were taken from Stephen Avery's garage. 6 blood swabs were taken from Stephen Avery's trailer, including blood swabs that were taken the same day that the RAV4 was found. So each one of those blood swabs contained the full genomic profile belonging to Stephen Avery. In total, there were 23 swabs that were both positive for the presence of blood through the presumptive test, and each one of them had the full genomic DNA STR profile of Stephen Avery. But note, 17 swabs did not come from the Toyota RAV4. Hence, none of these swabs would have come in contact with EDTA. They were all from fresh blood stains. Now, all it took was that any 3 of these 17 swabs could have been used to hand over to the FBI. And it's important to note that all of the swabs were processed by Culhane, and she did all the PCRs. Now, Culhane was questioned about this. Let's go through it. This was in the Stephen Avery trial. Question: and what you are really saying is that as far as you can tell, Mr. Avery is the original source of the DNA that you find in these stains, correct? Answer: I'm saying that his profile was consistent with what I found in the stains. Question: right, but what you are not saying is anything about how his DNA found its way inside the RAV4, are you? Answer: no. Your tests aren't designed to tell us how his DNA found its way into the location where you ultimately swabbed, are they? Answer: no. What you are looking for is a DNA profile, and if you find it, then you compare it to a known reference sample, in this case Mr. Avery, right? Answer: right. Question: but, take note, but if someone else planted Mr. Avery's DNA, or blood, or both, inside that vehicle, you wouldn't know that from these tests, would you? Answer: No. Question. So you cannot tell this jury with any degree of certainty, scientific or otherwise, that Stephen Avery was himself ever inside that vehicle, can you? Answer. No. Question. No meaning correct? Answer. That's correct. Now, why is this important? It essentially means that both the planting of blood in the RAV4 or swapping cannot be ruled out. Now remember, each one of those blood swabs had the full genomic DNA profile belonging to Stephen Avery. Okay, let's examine this. How plausible was a blood planting scenario? All right, let's consider this. If Stephen Avery had left about 6 drops of his blood in the Toyota RAV4, then he must have been actively bleeding because he's leaving his blood. Yet, consider this. This crime scene, the Toyota RAV4, is extremely clean. It's got 6 spots of blood. That's it. And no blood was noted on the following items in the car: the steering wheel, the gear shift lever, the handbrake lever, the exterior door handles, the interior door handles, the rear cargo door latch, the hood lock release lever, the hood and hood latch, the hood supporting rod, the battery cables and terminals, both of the number plates, and of course the RAV4 spare key and lanyard. Now, I'd covered this in a previous video, and it doesn't make any sense. You're either actively bleeding or you're not. And since the state said that Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey drove the RAV4 to where it was found, it meant that he had to have touched all of these items with his hands. And yet, only 6 drops of blood are found in the vehicle, nowhere else. Okay, so where actually is the blood? Now, we know that Pam Sturm, who is also Teresa's cousin, she was also a private investigator, and she was one of the individuals who found the RAV4. And I quote from the Stephen Avery trial. Question. And you got a decent look inside there because you actually saw some soda bottles too, I think, right? Answer. We did see some soda bottles. Question. Okay. And you didn't see Teresa, right? Answer. No. And you didn't see any blood, right? Answer. Not that we could visually see, no. Question. Okay. Well, you didn't see any blood, period. Answer. No. Well, we know her daughter was there as well, and she also found the RAV4, and she was questioned. This is Nicole. Question. Could you describe the lighting conditions inside of the vehicle, please? Answer. Well, the area that the vehicle is in, you can see there are trees and whatnot. It was a rather cloudy day. It was definitely dark. You couldn't visibly see. We did not have flashlights to be able to intricately look at details within the vehicle. Well, that's interesting. She was questioned further about this. Take note. So it was important to look inside the vehicle, not just at the outside, right? Answer. Correct. You saw no blood whatsoever, did you? Answer. It was a dark or very dark interior. Question. Ma'am, did you see any blood? Mr. Kratz interjects. Mr. Kratz. Judge, I will object as argumentative. She's trying to answer the question. If it's not yes or no, she should be able to explain. The court. That is a yes or no question. If the explanation is not sufficient on cross, you can ask it on redirect. Mr. Kratz. I will do that, Judge. Mr. Strang. My apologies. Mr. Buting. Question. So, yes or no, did you see any blood? Answer. No. You didn't have a flashlight with you, you said, right? Answer. No, I said I did not have a flashlight, yes. Question. Nevertheless, we are talking about a Saturday morning, right? It was daylight. Answer. Correct. Question. In fact, it was 10:30 in the morning, something like that. Answer. Correct. Question. It was not raining? Answer. No, it was not raining. All right, so here is an official crime lab photo of the interior, the front interior of the Toyota RAV4. And yes, you can see there are multiple water bottles in the RAV4, as well as a Wild Cherry Pepsi can. But what is very obvious, especially on the black CD case, was blood stains. And it's a little bit difficult to see the blood stain near the ignition. But Mr. Stolke in the Stephen Avery trial was questioned about the blood stains. Question. Can you use your laser pointer to point out the area that you observed these blood stains? Answer. Well, you can see some here, but there were stains throughout, basically covering, now note, 50% of the surface of the CD box. But you can see this is the most obvious stain on this photo. Yet no one who looked at the interior of the Toyota RAV4 had noticed any blood stains, especially one that covered 50% apparently of a CD case. So something unusual was going on. Now, what's the best evidence? Well, Nicole Sturm actually took, I think, 6 photographs of the Toyota RAV4. And have a look at this. You have a very clear view to the front of the dash. You can see that the glass is clear. So anyone looking at the front of that vehicle would have had a very clear, uninterrupted view of the dash and of the seats. And you can see this in this other photograph, that you also had a clear view to the front dash on the passenger side. All right, so to sum this up, was it really just a very simple shell game to fool the FBI? Because we know that the FBI had received these 3 blood swabs from the Wisconsin crime lab, state crime lab. And as you can see, they were labeled by the FBI Q46, Q47, and Q48. And really, we need to ask this question. Were the blood swabs actually swabbed for testing? Here's a serious accusation. Would the Wisconsin State Crime Lab ever be involved in nefarious activity? Well, unfortunately, we didn't have to wait for too long. We have this case communication record. Now, please note the date of that record, 11th of November. So it's very early on in the case. Why is that significant? Because this report, or this communication record, is only 1 day after the crime lab had found out that Stephen Avery's blood, and of course DNA, was found in the Toyota RAV4, and that his DNA was on the spare RAV4 key. And what occurred? What did occur to make this nefarious? Well, Special Agent Tom Fassbender, who's the co-lead investigator in the case, phones up the head of the DNA section of the laboratory and asks her to, I quote, try to put her in his house or garage. Now, of course, that is extremely nefarious. What happened to fair forensic testing? How could the lead investigator talk to the head of the DNA unit and make that remark? Now, when Culhane was questioned about this during the Stephen Avery trial, this was the facial expression given by Ken Kratz. He knew it was going to be very damaging, and it was. Now, I thought about the statement that Fassbender said, try to put her in his house or garage. Well, guess what? She did. The key, which apparently belonged to Teresa Halbach, was magically found in Stephen Avery's house. And furthermore, it had no traces, no forensic signs of Teresa Halbach, who was the owner of that key. It just magically had DNA from Stephen Avery. And to make matters even more nefarious, the entire swab was used in the PCR, which means no one can retest it. All right, now the state, they weren't dummies. They immediately got on the front foot using the media. Now, Stephen Avery was questioned, interrogated on November the 9th, and he was asked by Mark Wiegert the direct question, how does your DNA get inside of her car? Just straight like that. And Stephen said, that's because they got blood out of me. Now, why is this potentially nefarious? Well, look at the date. Remember, the Wisconsin DNA Data Bank search was done by Culhane on November the 10th, and that's written in her report. So how did Mark Wiegert know the search result one day in advance? That was very interesting. Also, Sheriff Jerry Pagel appeared on the news, and he stated the following. Never been in Teresa Halbach's vehicle? We now know that's a lie. But what you notice is this. Evidence planted. Stephen Avery was obviously talking to the media and saying that if my DNA or if my blood is in that car, they've planted it. And so very early on, even before the start of any trial, the concept of planting was out there. So what did Ken Kratz do? Well, on November the 11th, again, he did a press conference and he said, no longer a question who is responsible for the death of Teresa Halbach. Now, the case hasn't even been held, and these gentlemen, I use that term loosely, are already in the media painting a very dark picture for Stephen Avery. They know there's blood, they know there is DNA, and they're putting it out there immediately to put the guilt on one person only, Stephen Avery. All right, but there are other problems in the crime lab. Jerry Buting, attorney Jerry Buting, called for a probe of crime lab that was requested because there were analysts that had a lot of faulty work. But this one was particularly disturbing, and I'll quote, a DNA analyst was suspended for 2 days for being drunk on the job in 2006. The misconduct occurred around the same time and in the same laboratory where evidence in the Avery case was analysed, Buting said. This is simply unbelievable. Now, we don't know who that was, but you have to admit, in a crime laboratory, obtaining evidence that could potentially put a person in prison for murder, for life, what is going on in that crime lab? Alright, now, Buting and Strang wrote up the defendant's statement regarding planted blood. And I'll read it. Point number 28. Finally, note that the planting of Avery's blood need not necessarily have involved a widespread conspiracy, though it may have. The availability of the unsecured vial of Avery's blood and the substantial length of time when the vehicle remained at the scene, 3.5 hours before the DCI and 5 hours before the crime lab team arrived, provided ample opportunities for one or a few officers to complete the deed, and some individuals may even have unwittingly participated in parts of the scheme. So one has to beg the question, does one trust the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory and Culhane especially, who had done all the blood swabs, who had done all the PCRs? Does one actually trust the FBI's EDTA results? And I covered this in a previous video if you would like to have a look at it. Okay, we're now in a great position to ask some questions about the Steve Avery case. Did a flyover of the Avery salvage yard on the November the 4th, 2005 detect any Toyota RAV4 vehicle on the property? And the answer is it's unknown, right? There is a flyover video, but it's heavily edited. It's very difficult to see whether there was a Toyota RAV4 vehicle. Did anyone, including law enforcement officers that had torches with them, did anyone observe any blood in the Toyota RAV4 while it was at the Avery salvage yard? No, no one did. Did anyone observe any open doors or open a door of the Toyota RAV4 while at the Avery salvage yard? No. However, the Toyota RAV4 was sitting under tarps, so we don't know whether a door was in actual fact open while the vehicle was under a tarp. Was there an opportunity to have planted blood in the Toyota RAV4 after it had left the Avery salvage yard? Yes, there was plenty of time. Did anyone find an unlocked door of the Toyota RAV4 while at the Madison Crime Laboratory? Yes, the driver's side door was found unlocked. Was there a key available to have immediately opened that door at the Madison Crime Laboratory? No. A key was made, but it was made later on. Now, here's an interesting question. How many people would it have taken to have actually planted the blood in the Toyota RAV4? Just one. How long would it have taken to have planted the blood in the Toyota RAV4? You could do it within 1 or 2 minutes using a dropper. Not difficult to do at all. How much blood would have been needed to actually set up the Toyota RAV4? Well, 6 drops, or about 300 microliters minimum. So just a small volume of blood was all that was required. Was there a vial of blood from Stephen Avery that would have been readily available to obtain blood from? Yes, there was. Was the EDTA blood vial from Stephen Avery tampered with or had its lid open? Yes, it did. And we have photographic evidence that it did. How many people did the swabbing in the Toyota RAV4 and Stephen Avery's Pontiac Grand Am? One person, Cherie Culhane. Okay. How many swabs had blood from Stephen Avery and had his full genomic DNA STR profile on them? There were 23 minimum. There could have been even more that we don't know about. Who knew the blood and DNA results of every one of those swabs? Cherie Culhane. Who gave the 3 blood swabs to the FBI for EDTA testing? Very likely it was Cherie Culhane. Who was asked by the lead investigator, Tom Fassbender, in the case to, I quote, try to put her in his house or garage on the 11th of November? Cherie Culhane. Did the Toyota RAV4 hood latch, spare Toyota RAV4 key, bullet fragment known as item FL, and the crumpled number plates have any blood on them? No. So if they didn't have any blood, why then did Culhane test for DNA? Because she was asked this during the trial, and what she said was she normally tests a stain for a presumptive test for blood, and if it comes up positive, she then does a DNA test. Well, clearly none of these items had blood on them, so why did she do a DNA test? Interesting. Did any fingerprints found on the outside of the Toyota RAV4 belong to Stephen Avery or Brendan Dassey? No. Did the blood sample, item A23, which I did a video on, found on the cargo door handle of the exterior of the Toyota RAV4 belong to either Stephen Avery or Brendan Dassey? No. Did Stephen Avery have an actively bleeding finger? Yes, he did, but on November the 3rd. Did Brendan Dassey observe an actively bleeding finger on Stephen Avery on October the 31st? No, he did not. And here's the reason why. How many versions of how Stephen had cut his finger on October the 31st did Brendan Dassey tell Fassbender and Wiegert? Brendan gave at least 7 different contradictory versions. He is a completely unreliable witness. Why? Because he was never there. Was there any forensic evidence, DNA, blood, body fluids, hair, clothing, handcuffs, bedding, pillows, bedhead, bedposts, wood paneling, and carpet that Teresa Halbach was ever inside Stephen Avery's trailer? None. Was there any physical evidence that corroborated anything that Brendan Dassey had told Fassbender and Wiegert in regards to the sexual assault and murder of Teresa Halbach? None. Did the state explain why fine blade and saw cuts, cremated and heavily fragmented human bones belonging to one individual were found in at least 3 separate geolocations: Stephen Avery's burn pit, Yonder burn barrel number 2, and the Manitowoc County gravel pit? No, they didn't. Did the state prove that Teresa Halbach was burnt in Stephen Avery's burn pit as opposed to bones having been moved there? No, they didn't. Was the state coroner permitted on the Avery salvage yard to document the human cremains? No, she wasn't. In fact, she was threatened with arrest. That's the state's coroner. Were there any in situ photographs of the human cremains anywhere? No. Did the state link item FL to the cranial bone fragments that had elemental lead embedded in them? No. And I did a video on this as well. Did the state give back the human cremains to the Halbach family? Yes, they did in 2011. Has the state still got in its possession the Toyota RAV4 for a forensic re-examination by Kathleen Zellner? Unknown, and likely that vehicle is gone. Alright, now I've come to the end of my presentation. And this is serious. This is whether someone who works in a crime laboratory would do anything nefarious. And I found this. This is the story of David Kofoed, and it's worth reading out. And keep in mind what we have just been talking about. I quote, "In 2006, Nebraska Crime Lab Commander David Kofoed purported to find a small trace of murder victims' blood underneath the driver's side dashboard of a suspected getaway car in a grisly farmhouse murder. The blood corroborated a false confession from a mentally challenged relative who implicated himself and another cousin, even though no physical evidence at the extremely bloody crime scene had linked the two cousins to the shotgun slayings roughly 30 miles away. Later, DNA residue found on a drug pipe and an engraved ring dropped by the real killers excluded the Nebraska cousins. Instead, the DNA implicated two Horricon, Wisconsin teenagers who were on a cross-country crime spree. Ultimately, the Wisconsin killers pleaded guilty and murder charges were dismissed against the Nebraska cousins. Now note, the FBI later determined that Kofoed used a blood-soaked shirt collected from one of the murder victims to frame the Nebraska cousins. Now remember, this guy is the Nebraska Crime Lab Commander. I continue. Not realizing at the time that they were truly innocent. The FBI also uncovered another high-profile Nebraska murder case from 2003 in which Kofoed planted blood to frame someone who already confessed and later pleaded guilty to murdering a small child. In 2010, a Nebraska judge found Kofoed guilty of tampering with evidence. In the pair of unrelated murder cases, Kofoed later served 2 full years in state prison. Take note, these days he no longer works in law enforcement and now resides in Charlotte, North Carolina. So yes, indeed, even a commander of a crime lab is involved in nefarious activities. Now, if you read this, does it actually remind you of another similar case? In this particular case, do we have planted evidence against Stephen Avery? And I gave a scenario in which it was very easy to plant the blood in the Toyota RAV4. With Brendan's case, there's absolutely no forensic evidence against him at all. Alright guys, that is the end of my presentation. I used the following references, and of course if you wish to go to read them at your pleasure. And I also like to thank everyone for their great comments and feedback. And if you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask questions in the comment sections. And I like to leave you with this particular thought. It's hard to believe that all of the framing could have been done against Stephen Avery with a small quantity of blood and 3 blood swabs. That's all it took to frame this man.